Morning, Tim. John. Yeah.
Terrible lighting. I'm sorry.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
I don't really want a halo outshining my real halo, you know?
Oh, yeah. Mark is arriving. Looks like Lewis has been very active in the Obsidian Vault, so I'm hoping that he'll be joining. There he is. Okay. Hello, Mark.
Dan, have you sent out a new Obsidian Vault?
I have not. Basically, I just made a new folder within the one that we were using.
And what's that folder called?
It's called Antinet.
Okay.
It's number 6, I think, in the list.
All right. Thanks. I'll take a look.
Okay. Yeah, there was a moment there when the part of the vault blew up. And I'm not going to point any fingers, but I was able to restore it, so that worked out all right. So yeah, if you notice anything else missing, and Lewis, welcome. I'm glad I saw you were updating the vault, so I assumed you were on your way too. And Pat is here. Hi, Pat and Stephanie. Good morning. We will. Well, it's 10 o'clock, so.
Detected at the rear front door.
Oops. I imagine there will be. I imagine there will be a few more people rolling in, but kind of maybe in the interest of staying on schedule and on task, we'll start with just basically some introductions. So I'll go first. My name's Dan Alasso. I teach history, mostly environmental and modern world history and U.S. history at Bemidji State University, which is a small regional university in the Minnesota state system. And I've been doing that for about 5 years. I'm relatively old to be a kind of an early career academic. I had a career before I went back to. I had a career in high tech, so I was in the computer business, in hardware, mostly selling, and then also I was a systems administrator, and then I was actually a systems engineer for Silicon Graphics for a while, just when they were sort of peaking before they crashed and burned, which was not my fault. I told them not to build using Intel architecture, but they didn't pay any attention. So anyway, that's kind of where I'm coming from. I write a lot, and I'm mostly interested kind of in the output-oriented stuff. So and I've made myself a bunch of cards for the first section of the book that I'm ready to talk about. So that's me. So why don't we basically introduce ourselves and then nominate kind of the next person in the list. So going in reverse order of arrival, I think that would make Stephanie next.
Sure. Yeah, so my name is Stephanie. I'm from Connecticut and I'm an entrepreneur. And I'm very new to this idea of Zettelkasten. I've always been interested in, I love learning, and I've always been interested in writing, but never found a way to organize it all. It always ended up, in all the isolated notebooks, and you never figured out how to get them back together at the right time. So I'm very intrigued by this idea, and I've been following Scott for a little less than a year. So I'm excited to get the book in my hands too and really dive in. I have my little note card box, but I'm definitely still building.
Great. So why don't you nominate the next person?
Oh, sure. How about Mark?
Okay, I'm Mark Graby. I'm one of the older, probably maybe the oldest, I don't know, member of this group. I'm a retired academic. I spent my entire career somewhere in higher education. I'm an educational psychologist who maybe spent 20 years interested in educational technology. I got interested in this collective because of the focus on digital note taking and its offshoots. I was interested in student study behavior that morphed into the use of technology in improving study effectiveness. So I studied note taking and expert notes and collective notes, and this material just seemed like a natural offshoot of that long-term interest.
Excellent. So, not name somebody to go next.
Sorry, I muted myself first. Greg.
Hello. Yes, my name is Greg Simarusti. Let's see, I'm a project / program manager for in IT for a large law firm based in Atlanta, although I live in Ponte Vedra, Florida. So it's kind of nice to be able to work from wherever you want to, type of thing. I've been playing with Obsidian for probably, I don't know, maybe a year and a half, maybe a little bit longer. And but when I came across Scott's videos, I really wanted to say, since it's funny because I used to use Todoist, and then I went straight to bullet journaling and just just in a book, handwriting everything out. And I noticed the big difference. Even though what's kind of funny, I still use Todoist, but every morning as a ritual, I write out my planner as well as all my to-dos and whatever. And just the process of redoing that manually made so much sense, and it really stuck with me. And it feels like a much more of an accomplishment when I actually get to check something off, physically check it off. So that's why I was really interested in finding out about the manual version of doing doing a Zettelkasten. And so really kind of wanted to find out from you guys, are you all analog? Are you digital? A little of both? What's the pros and cons of each? Because I do have a big investment in Obsidian in terms of the number of notes or whatever that I've taken. But to be honest with you, I have not taken them in the way that Scott actually outlines it. And what I really appreciate about what Scott's, at least from the videos I've seen, I'm really looking forward to diving deep into his book. I was just starting to go over the ebook, yesterday, but I'm really looking forward to finding out how to properly do the notes, very similar to what Nicholas Luhmann had done. And because I kind of see his point in that, where it felt like with Obsidian, I was definitely a note taker and not a note maker. Right. It just felt that way. I was just grabbing, cutting and pasting everywhere and putting into these notes thinking, oh, just because if you saw my Evernote's huge, but I've never gone back to look at those notes. Right. Same concept. So anyways, that's where I'm from and that's where I'm about. So how about I'll go to Nicholas. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Okay. I'm a 16-year-old high school student. Currently, I'm working on, I'm currently building neuroevolution algorithms. I'm trying to I recently built a neuroevolution algorithm to simulate an ecosystem. So I've been working with artificial intelligence just in my free time for fun. I've been using an Antinet for roughly 2 years now, actually. So here's what it looks like. I started following Scott basically right after he posted his first video, and I've been doing stuff ever since. So yeah, let's go with Chris.
Pick the guy with his microphone off. I presume we're doing quick intros.
Yes.
I have a background in biomedical and electrical engineering. Goodness, I've been playing around in these areas for far too long, such that I got bored with what's happening contemporarily and started digging into the deep history. So I've chased the trail of some of these patterns and ideas back into intellectual history going back 2,000 plus years. And some of them actually, we got some reasonable evidence go back as far as 65,000 years ago in oral tradition. So I have dug deeply into the sociology and anthropology of a lot of this particular area, although big swaths of my own space are filled with index cards on anthropology. There's a lot of abstract math, a lot of really, really heavy abstract math. Communication theory, information theory, all the fun stuff. So I must say I'm curious to hear what others think of all of this crazy that I think most people just think only existed in the last 5 or 10 years, but really we've been doing it for a lot longer. Not having seen the prior list and being 2 minutes late, I'm going to take a guess that John Wilkins hasn't gone yet. Maybe?
No. Hi, my name is John Wilkins. I'm a retired math professor, although I still teach one class that I love, the history of mathematics. And over the 15 years teaching the course, I've collected probably 1,500 to 2,000 notes in between Devon, Think, and Obsidian. But it's mostly kind of excerpt type notes, and it hasn't been as helpful as I'd like. So I'm very curious about the analog. I've been watching Scott's videos. I got the book yesterday and started reading the PDF that comes with it. So I'm very curious. It seems to me that Obsidian is so much more efficient in installing notes, to use his term, but yet he was very deep into Obsidian and has rejected it. So I've got to respect that. So I'm very curious about the analog method and how that might be more helpful. Yeah. So let's, Lewis.
Hi, I'm Lewis Martin. I'm an architect from the UK, but I now live in Finland. I've been in this Obsidian Book Club since the beginning, just because of my interest in PKM and Zettelkasten. And I've been using Obsidian for about 18 months, a bunch of other things before that too. I have found Obsidian to be more useful than those other tools. I tend to keep it open all the time, and so I'm journaling in it and I'm taking notes for work in it, and basically I sort of filter everything through through it. So it's interesting for me to see someone like Scott, who is very much for the analog method, and I would like to find out more about it. So I'm about 80% of the way through the book, and I think that's very interesting that Pat has been looking at doing a much more kind of analog version in the digital world. So I'm not yet. I'm not sure if I'm the right person to do myself, make a Antinet, but I'm interested to find out more and read the book and listen to the conversation around it. Yeah. Okay. So maybe since I name dropped in, what about Pat next?
Hello, I'm Pat McNamara. I'm a retired chemical engineer, and I started using 3x5 cards to file engineering articles 50 years ago. I have been using a digital system for about 23 years called The Brain. Yeah. And having read the book, The Antinet Zettelkasten, I've now adapted those techniques to use in The Brain to create a digital Antinet Zettelkasten, which I think has the benefits of digital and the physical card system without handwriting. I will admit that I will not gain the benefits of handwriting, but I think there are more benefits, at least for me, with 23 years worth of stuff already in my PKM. that this is the way I will continue to go forward. So with that, let me ask Mr. Hume to tell us who he is.
Hi, yeah, my name is Matthew van der Hoorn. On the internet, I'm more known as Mr. Horn because I give regular study advice and based on science in the I Can Study server of Justin Sung. I do a lot of research into learning science. My current favorite subject is cognitive load theory. I have been using an Antinet for, well, since May this year. So I do have quite some cards in my old Zettelkasten. I have been using Obsidian before that for months, but I found that it had no real value for me, and I can also justify that momentarily because of my expertise in certain science subjects. So based on that, I am continuing to use the analog way, which enforces the neural imprinting, like Scott calls it. I don't mind how other people do it, of course. That's up to them. And I joined this book club because I enjoy reading, of course. I'm an intellectual and a logician. But also because I want to read Scott Scheper's book on the Antinet Zettelkasten, which I haven't begun reading yet. I have ordered a copy and I can speed read, so I'm up to date pretty quickly when I get it in my hands. If there are questions to me, you can always just find me on the internet. I think my most famous account is LinkedIn. So I don't know who else needs to still say who they are. So I'm just going to give the mic to Dan and Lasso, and he can choose someone who has not been there yet.
Okay, yeah, I think Alaman and Tim still need to go. So Alaman, why don't we go to you?
Hey, aloha. Thanks, Dan. I'm Ali Sears, CEO and co-founder of a psychiatric agency here in Honolulu. But more importantly, I'm a philosopher, and I've been teaching at the university for about 23 years now. And I've been using Obsidian since last March, and what a huge revelation for my writing and all that stuff. So, and I really appreciate this group, Dan, because I can't find anything like this anywhere else. So, and Nicholas, I mean, it's so fantastic. You're whatever you said, 16 or 17 years old, you're into all this stuff already. It's like, wow, blows my mind. I didn't find any of this stuff till I was 60 years old. Yes. So, you've got this whole thing ahead of you. It's just fantastic. John, I'm really interested to hear what you had to say about Alfred North Whitehead, because I'm a sort of an expert in his philosophy and metaphysics and theology, but not the mathematics part. So thanks.
Thanks, Alaman. And now we'll go to Tim.
Hi. Building engineering background professionally, with most of that time has been client-facing, project-facing work. So now, particularly, information management is becoming more and more and more valid, such that many parts of the world you now have to have effectively an electronic book form of the whole progress of the project, not just from your perspective, but we all write to the same structure, albeit we write in different styles and different detail. But way back when I was designing buildings, periodically I'd get shoved into the research group where internal clients would come along with problems that more than the standard engineer would cope with. And within the research group, we'd solve that, which invariably means we needed to change some or add to some software somewhere. So I had a good couple of years writing Fortran stuff, but never as a fluent translator, as it were, more brute force than anything. Subsequently, also left the UK and now reside in the Middle East quite happily. And amongst other things, should be having a good whack at COP28 next year. Using this, though, as the others know, there's still 30,000 plus notes in Evernote after trying OneNote the year it came out or the year after it came out. And migrating by choice from projects and/or, oh, I've got a spare 10 minutes, let's move a few more notes. So they either come from the structure of Evernote, and when they get copied over, they just get dumped into an archive within Evernote just for the hell of it. And either the cut and paste decides to cut and paste to the waste bin, or the cut and paste goes somewhere and it gets a bit massaged. And this is where I think, in part, learning from Dan versus learning from Sonka Aaron's book and the group generally over all the books we've read versus this one, it will be, do I need to go back to the joys of knowing, being able to literally lift my arm up and pick up a book without looking at it because I know where it is, versus I can search for it digitally, or I can search for it because I know the order of the books because of Dewey Decimal System. So the numbering of the Zettel is clearly of itself not really necessary for the digital because you can search for anything. But I'm still using a few folders, most of which are project orientated, because the projects are fundamentally, from an external point of view, isolated, different, even if they're for the same client. However, I want all of that learning available for the next one. So I'm not locking it away in a different vault because I can't search, but I am ultimately on anything I need to give out, put it in a new vault, stroke publishing that way. So that's where I'm at, and I'm probably only 5,000 notes out of a 30,000 through, but most of them are, strictly speaking, Evernote key things like this is, the usual, even down to the level of, say, the way Steve Dotto used to sell Evernote, on the basis of you're in the hardware shop and you've forgotten what filter size your dishwasher is, or you need your insurance information at the drop of a hat. None of that is applicable to the creativity that is available within Obsidian. So I've had no intention of losing it as the notebook that's in my back pocket. I'm just not using it as a creative platform, or a research platform would be a better way of putting it. And I must admit, I quite liked the look of Canvas when it popped up last week. But I think it still needs a lot to be much more dynamic. It seems to be rather static at the moment, but it's only the first beta release anyway. So,
okay, so let me cut you off there for a second, Tim, because I do want to get to Canvas, but and for people who have just who are new, for whom this is their first meeting, yes, we do talk a lot about tools, and we talk a lot about our experiences with them and comparing different ones, and advocating for different ones. Personally, I'm a little bit peeved at Canvas right now, but I also have my cards, and I actually am trying out, and I actually had sort of begun trying out the actual analog paper way before just before I first ran into Scott and so I want to get to kind of the things that he says in the introduction, this kind of big introductory section, which I kind of consider the intro and the first 4 chapters all to be kind of introduction to the meat of the book, which I think is going to get a lot meatier and a lot less of a kind of a fun narrative read as we go. I didn't follow his advice and go to chapter 11 first and all that kind of stuff. Pat, I think you did, and then you said, "There's no way I'm doing that." Was that the way you kind of reacted to that? Yeah. My initial thoughts about going to cards was that I had I don't know how many thousand little nodes in my Obsidian graph, but I was having a lot of trouble getting them out, and that may have been I'll be the first to admit, because I really right now don't care to be a kind of a deep power user and a chooser and installer of modules and plugins and a kind of an optimizer of the app. I just want to use an app for getting my ideas in and then moving them around and then getting them back out. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. But I would like to kind of begin talking about this section of the book, and I'm sure we'll come back to these questions of of Obsidian and paper and the brain and Skrintle and on the way to not talking about that, I will say that I'm a little bit peeved that everybody's thinking of Canvas as the Skrintle killer, but we can come back to that again as well. So what were people's initial reactions to the beginning of this, to the way that Scott, I mean, I think that part of it was sort of putting his stake in the ground as it kind of relates to the tone and the approach that he's going to take to this. How did that work for people?
Yeah, it's a different kind of book written in a different style. I mean, I found it somewhat annoying, to tell you the truth, but that's maybe part of his shtick here. I mean, I've read most of it now, and I'm not convinced. So I'm kind of like those who believe you try to understand the underlying mechanisms of thinking, retaining, and organizing information externally. And if you can identify the key features that makes it effective, why can't you do that with a digital tool? So, but that's what I'm looking for. I'm trying to get someone to help me understand what he thinks the underlying mechanisms are. Mm-hmm. And I think that's key to any of us. I don't know. That's what I'm looking to take away anyway.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I personally got the impression that the underlying mechanism, and I don't remember where it is, I guess we'll come to it, was the index. And I think that is going to, we're going to come back around to kind of Pat's challenge at some point as well. But how did others feel about the way that Scott begins this?
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh yeah, sorry, Greg. Okay, I'll quickly say something. I kind of found myself in my highlights and notes going back over the first 4 chapters, either strongly disagreeing or strongly agreeing with him. And I found like maybe Scott was banging on a little bit too much about the analog and how like it was so much better than the digital. But the meat of the book, which we'll come to later, is much more interesting and satisfying. But yeah, I also found it I guess because I'm digital first, and I haven't poked my feet into the sort of water of the analog Zettelkasten that I found it kind of repetitively going on about how good that was. So yeah, but otherwise I enjoyed it. Yeah.
Okay.
I was just going to say, I kind of enjoyed the journey. Be honest with you, I was kind of listening to, as I was reading, I kind of felt like I was kind of going through the journey with him because, I had also done the whole, going down with Obsidian, and I still really enjoy Obsidian. And I know when he was talking about Nick Milo and he had gone through the course. I hadn't gone through Nick's course or anything like that, but and there's so many followers of Obsidian that I know it's a fantastic tool. I'm just trying to find out what is really going to work best for me in the way that I work. And like I said, I kind of use the digital for to-do items, but I'm really finding out that using a bullet journal and writing actually works better for me. Maybe I'm just old school. I don't know. And I bought a substantial amount of cards. I've got a bunch of stuff ready to get going. I want to read his book first because I want to do it right, if you want to consider it that way. I know he's done his research and he really kind of gets into all the research that he does, to be able to get to doing it the way, not that Anke's Soren talks about, but the way that actually Nicholas Luhmann and those before him, had actually come about. So I really like the history of it because it really starts to build my interest in finding out all the background. I guess for me, I'm a lot of the, what's he called, the majors of the minors or the minors of the majors or whatever. I really get into the nuances of it. That's just the way I work or whatever. So I like the background.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I did think that it was kind of. I see your hand, Tim. I'll be right with you. I thought that it was helpful that the very first thing that he did was sort of distinguish the terminology. Say, the way that I'm using this word is not the way that everybody else is using it. And because I think so much of the time our confusion over terminology is where a lot of our the root of our disagreements and our conflicts. And so it's, so it was good. I also liked actually, and I wrote a note as I was in the PDF, as I was reading it, that when he gives that laundry list of all of the people who used things like a Zettelkasten, and then he mentioned Conrad Gessner, and I go, there you go, Chris. So, because this is, when Chris mentioned that he, when he was introducing himself, that he had, we were going back, 65,000 years. That came up in our very first time together when we were talking about the dawn of everything, which, goes into that prehistory and talks about that. So yeah, the idea that these are, the idea that it is it's a thing. Now, okay, let's go to Tim and then we'll go to and then let's go to the chat, okay? Because I want to stay up to speed with that.
So the thing I found, particularly with the tone of the preface and the almost trying to set up a them and us, as in analog versus digital, was, I think, the clear way of, particularly Obsidian, not necessarily things like Notion, but maybe Rome, which I didn't touch very much, is the way that, and certainly works for me, is it encourages the way the gardeners talk about their database as a garden, their cultivation, such that you can take the dumb note, the highlight or the quote, you can put what that felt like or what that meant to you or what the context was, and you can grow it from there. And I've noticed, a bit like Greg was saying earlier about, he's got his however many years worth of Evernote, but virtually totally never went back to a single note. And yet I've probably touched all 5,000 odd notes in Obsidian. even over the last 6 months, 5 times. Even only if it's to check that, no, I don't need to put that new link in or that new tag or that's not really quite the one I thought of.
Mm-hmm.
But push it to one side, push it a bit further out on the say graphical model, which maybe Canvas will solve a bit more, but we don't know yet. So the thing that has riled me a bit is the way he's got a case to make. So he's got to set up some bottles to be knocked over to a certain extent. Is that the divide, particularly with programs that are seemingly or actually originally designed in a Zettel type mode, setting up this dichotomy of them versus us, which sort of riled me a bit. And I put my back up a bit in that context because he uses the Evernote as an example of ways not really to do things. And I agree. You know, Evernote was done as a place to dump every bit of information, you know, bank account numbers, passport numbers, filter numbers, wife's car registration, whatever, plus lots of other stuff, none of which seems applicable to Obsidian, for instance. So that was the thing that wound me up most over particularly the preface.
Yeah. Well, and I think that your experience with actually tending 5,000 notes is going to be key, right? So, and that's one of the things that I wonder a lot, and it concerns me a lot with these different tools. Is how much do we actually, how much time and energy do we spend tending the garden?
It may be that because of the transport or the exchange from one program to another, whilst having the choices of those notes fundamentally driven from a current project or two, has meant I have the incentive and therefore the time to go back and touch them, such that I am bridging this chasm that apparently everybody or those people that are either all one or the other seem to think there is. And that, I agree, it may just be an oddball circumstance. When I get to 20,000, it may not be so easy.
Yeah. Okay, let's go to Nicholas, sorry.
Either one works. I guess I wanted to add on to what Tim and you are saying with having a lot of notes already pre-built somewhere else. I guess the main criteria you should check there for whether it's worth switching to an analog or not is whether you're actually checking those notes again, as you mentioned. Because if you have, let's say you do have 20,000 notes, which I'm sure some of you actually do, some of you have mentioned, if you're actually using them, then it's incredibly useful. You should keep them and keep using them the way that you are. But if you just have 10,000 notes left in some folder somewhere that you haven't checked in 5 years, looking at those and going, no, I can't swap because I have all these notes. I believe that's a sunk cost fallacy, if I remember the name, where you have invested a lot of time into this folder, but if you're not using them, investing more won't get you anywhere. So in that case, I would recommend at least trying an analog system or trying a different tool, seeing how it works. And then if it doesn't work, then swapping back to what's already existing.
Nick, if I could just ask, are you fully analog or are you digital or both?
I started with Obsidian. What I noticed would happen is that I would take notes on Obsidian and I would read those notes again and I would understand what I had written down, but I wouldn't have any other cue that would come back to me. Whereas with analog notes, what happens is that I'll take a note, read what's written on it, and then an entire train of thought will come back. Like the note itself acts as a cue when it's analog, whereas on digital, it was the content of the note. And on digital, there was more content in the note. There was more written down on Obsidian that I could read and absorb again. But in analog, it was more of a cue for the train of thought that led to that note. So I guess there are different kinds of they're different benefits to the type of note. They just act differently, and the information that you or knowledge that you get back from reading the note is different.
Mhm. Mhm. There's a thing that Scott says, and he only mentions it in a footnote, and so I assume, and he doesn't cite, so I assume it comes from someplace. He talks about a mindset of contribution, and it is, and it kind of jumped out at me a little bit, because I think that it has something to do with sort of what we're talking about here, and what I'm reading in the notes about how central Luhmann is, and and how much Luhmann is gospel, as opposed to because Scott also spends a lot of time in this section talking about what he calls the availability cascade, which I don't think of in exactly that same way, but the translations of translations of translations, sort of oversimplifying and kind of locking in, if not misinterpretations, at least particular interpretations of what Luhmann had said, or what an original source had said, and so and I do kind of see that, and I don't. And I kind of feel similarly to what some people have said about kind of pushing back on this us and them kind of thing, but I think that it does make sense to really sort of set the playing field and identify why some of the people who are saying that Zettelkasten are not saying the same thing. Did other people react to that in these chapters?
I definitely noticed it, but I kind of took it more as passion. And if I'm going to learn something from someone, I want them to be all in and excited about it. So, and I mean, I can make my own decisions, and I can see where he might be being a little heavy-handed with his personal opinions, but I appreciate the passion, and I also like his kind of snarky style too. It entertains me. But yeah, I think one of the most impactful things, I think I only got through the first 2 chapters, but I think one of the most impactful things was, Sange Aaron's book. He really emphasizes how much Luhmann was able to produce, and then the demystifying that Scott did of the fact that the writing was like really dense and not super revised. So like he wasn't spending a lot of time like with the artistry, with the crafting of it. It just kind of, I'm a perfectionist high achiever. So when I hear that someone is producing X amount, I'm like, oh, I should be doing that, or I could be doing that. So it just kind of, it was a reminder of just making sure that you take a balanced approach that's appropriate to your own individual goals. And it works for Luhmann, and it, and all, Scott did an excellent job of laying out all the reasons why he did it that way, and what society was like at that time, and the society that he was in. But it also created the ability to kind of think about the why and what I'm looking to get out of it, and not feel like Luhmann is some sort of gold standard of how it should be done.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it probably was a little bit necessary. I think Scott felt, and I would tend to agree with him, to sort of say, because people have said, for example, that that Luhmann's writing is bad because of the Zettelkasten, or that Sanke Aaron's book is bad because it was based on on these notes that he made, and there's certainly some evidence to that, but nothing. I think you're right, Stephanie, that attention to the writing process and the editing process wouldn't have dealt with. It just seems that Luhmann wasn't that interested in that part of communicating his ideas. He was more interested in having them and expressing them in a way that the type of people that he wanted to understand them would, right? But that maybe the general reader wouldn't, and that might be protection for him as well.
Yeah, I think it's important to remember too, especially as you're debating like analog versus digital, and kind of like what Nick said, just taking all the information and then do what works for you, because this clicks with Scott's brain and his way of doing things. Lumen's system clicks with his brain and his way of doing things, but we're all unique individuals. So take what you want and leave the rest. It's here to serve you. You're not here to serve it. So just because Scott says one thing doesn't mean that that's the way. It's just a way. And the whole point is to create a second brain, but like your second brain. So do what's gonna click with your brain and the way you process information.
Yeah. I think that to respond to Matthew in the chat, I think that basically my understanding of what Scott did was that he had his notes, he sort of laid them out, put them together. There is one moment, actually, if you read closely, where he uses exactly the same example, and then he begins a new section and he uses the same example once again. And it's like, okay, those were two sort of granular thoughts that came out of a sort of a review of his cards. But then, editing would have noticed that. I think one of the things that interests me a lot is sort of the question of the tangled web versus the linearity of a narrative, right? And my sort of my go-to metaphor, the one that I keep coming back to, is sort of a forest and paths through the forest, right? So if all of my knowledge is this forest, I still, if I'm going to communicate that, I'm not sure I understand. Oh, stop it. Sorry about that. I still have to kind of make a path through it to write a narrative, right? And to have, A lead to B, lead to C, and I have to provide that connective tissue and stuff. At least I feel, to go to your point, Stephanie, I feel that that's what I need to do when I'm writing, a history textbook chapter for my students, right? They need to sort of see that it begins someplace and it goes someplace, and there's, and they're interested in sort of following the path. That's probably not the only way to do it. And I am really kind of fascinated with nonlinear ways of approaching, bundles or packages or fields of information, which is one of the reasons that I'm really interested in the, kind of the board, the workboard version, visual thing that Skrintle is doing and that now maybe Canvas is going to do. So the tangled thing, I think, is not necessarily a bug. It could be a feature, but communication is a separate sort of an issue that gets overlaid on top of that.
To me, one of the interesting things of watching it and having seen most of Scott's process for 2 years and things happening before that is seeing bits and pieces of his reading being ensconced either into his cards, which he's occasionally shown over time, or that he's spoken about or written about in other spots as this has evolved to what this thing is now finally. And I have to be careful too, because I read an early draft of this back in like late July, early August, I think, and made some notes and kind of gave them back. And it's bits and pieces of things even that I've seen Dan talk about, or Sasha Fast, or myself, or other people kind of in this space, and how those creep into arguments he makes or doesn't make, and into some of the I'm loath to call it kind of religious fervor, but it impinges on that definitely in terms of how he frames things. And he's kind of softened up a little, I think, now that he's got something to sell. It's nice that he takes an opinion and he takes a stance, but he also sometimes, I think, has not left room for how other people would like to do this or what works best for them, which I think is missing broadly from big chunks of all of this. Is And I think it's even compounded by a lot of it being on the internet and discussions that are happening around it, rather than, it's one thing when Erasmus puts out a book and that becomes kind of the only source. You don't get to talk to Erasmus necessarily. You may be able to write to him, but it's going to be one-on-one communication and not mass communication. But then everyone can see what everyone else's method is. But it's not always clear what the full method they're using is and how that specifically works or doesn't work for them. And often they're not able to say, I do this part for this reason. And one of the things I think is missing a lot is the kind of serendipity discussion of either flipping through cards or finding old things through search that then spark new ideas. And it's those second and third order effects that have much better longer term consequences for why one would want to do this. And that's so much more rarely spoken of in these things. And usually I have been collecting examples of it where people say, this idea of note taking is magic, or it's, there's this extra insight or this, third eye. There's less of that, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Magic usually is the word that's thrown in. And 9 times out of 10, that magic is easily definable, but no one's thinking about why it's magic or what is coming out of it that makes it that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and two thoughts based on that, Chris. To go back to Mark a while back, your question in the chat about the videos. I think Scott does sort of demonstrate some of his process in the later videos. There are a bunch of videos that he does earlier on where he's like got a phone camera and he's walking around and it just makes me dizzy. So I don't watch those. But the later ones, I think are probably useful for that. The other thing that you reminded me of, Chris, is that although we're talking about Scott doing this, I think he brings up an interesting point that other people have sort of, and he doesn't say it, and so I sort of wrote it in when I was reading it, that people are staking territory, right? They're trying to create their own intellectual property around some of the elements of this, whether they're calling it LYT or getting things done precedes it, but second brain, or all of these things, right? These are little empires that people are building, and so they, of course they're focused on the differentiation, and on the thing that they think is the particular value add.
I think that's also something that happens over time. So like staking of territory, no matter which tool you use, over time you develop your own, your own ways of using it.
Mm-hmm.
There's a word for it. So for example, conventions, that's it. You develop your own conventions with that tool. Mm-hmm. So even with, I think tools that allow you to develop your own conventions generally are useful as long as you don't spend more time developing your own conventions than developing knowledge.
Yeah.
Which I think is a trap. That's a trap I fell into when I was using Obsidian, is that I spent more time developing my conventions than developing knowledge.
Yep.
So if you're able...
Same goes for tools. Same goes for tools and plugins.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's convention as well, tools and plugins. So if you're able to... I think I just didn't have enough self-discipline to spend more time developing knowledge than developing conventions. If you're able to spend more time developing knowledge than conventions, I think that's great. I think digital has a lot of aspects that analog doesn't have, but I also think analog, for me, it just makes it specifically about the knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
Like the conventions are more limited, but still useful. So for example, a convention I have in my Antinet that I don't think Scott has, or I don't think I've seen other people use it, is the collective cards in the beginning of like a thought stream. I have a little square there in the address, and that square just means before everything else. So that's just a convention that's like, here, this is the first card of this line of thought because it's an outline of the line of thought. and you
Mhm.
always put this in front of everything else.
So it's kind
So
of a, yeah.
Yeah, so developing those conventions, no matter the tool you're using, I think is important, as long as it's not the main thing that you're spending time on.
Yeah. One of the things that fascinates me too is the way that tools, I won't say determine, but influence our processes, right? All of a sudden we have, Markdown, and we can do bidirectional linking. So now bidirectional linking is the thing. We have tags, so we'll do tagging. And that's one of the things that I'm curious, and that's one of the reasons that I'm experimenting with this. And although I will admit, full disclosure, I am doing this and Scrintl simultaneously. And so I'm writing the card. So as I was reading, first I read and highlighted and made notes in the PDF. Then I made cards. And then this afternoon, I will basically reproduce these cards in Scrintl, because then I'll be able to determine, hopefully in the long run, in the course of, I don't know if I'll be able to do it in the course of this, but whether or not I'm getting more traction from, my card catalog or from that. And I am numbering the cards, and I am numbering them when I put them in Scrintl as well. So we'll see. I mean, yeah, I think that the tool that seems to me, and I have read Luhmann's, especially the communicating with slip boxes, but a couple of his other things. I have just requested the book, the shortcuts book that Scott mentions a lot, which apparently there are only about a dozen libraries in the country that have a copy. So I'm not sure if I'll get it. I might have to read it in German, but yeah. And I've read some of Schmidt, but I think indexing, keywords and indexing seem to be, to jump back about 5 minutes in the conversation, kind of seem to be where the power of this, and if there is magic in this, where it would be. I mean, I remember when I was in the Rome, I don't know if it was second book group, they were promising magic. They were promising that the software was going to create this magical moment when we'd have emergence, the sum would be greater than the parts, and that was going to be, like the singularity. Didn't happen for me with Rome. Didn't happen for me with Obsidian. But maybe that's because I wasn't enough of a power user. So I'm willing to accept that possibility too.
Well, while we're talking about tools, though, and I don't think I've seen Scott or anyone else, really, for that matter, make the argument on behalf of analog, with kind of the backup being with a pen and paper, there's only so much you can do. You're not going to be able to add 5 new plugins and 4 shiny new things to that analog system. There's only really so much you can do. And evolving an analog system is way, way harder, unless you're just going to do it in a messy, sloppy, I'm just going to throw this thing in there and totally change my convention sort of way. And that's much harder to do, to end up going down all those rabbit holes. So if you're using a pen and index cards, you're far, far less likely to go down the weird rabbit holes versus, okay, I'm just going to read and make notes and create these trains of thought. It's kind of odd. There's been a side conversation in a weird side channel that Bob Dotto and I have been having over the last week or two that has kind of impinged on John Culkin's quote, and there's various versions of it over the last 100 years, but essentially, we shape our tools, and then thereafter our tools shape us. And where does that kind of process begin and end? But that quote's usually misattributed to McLuhan, and I think it's because Culkin is a close friend and associate of him. And I think he wrote it in a book that had McLuhan's name in it. Or I should say probably an article. I want to say it was a Saturday Evening Post thing or Sunday Review maybe. But that kind of how you think about your tools, and do we think about, I think Bob was saying something about, do you think about your Obsidian digital tool the same way you might an analog tool? Like, I have more emotional attachment to some of my pens or to specific hammers or screwdrivers in my toolbox. And I'd much rather use my hammer than use someone else's hammer,
Absolutely.
even if to all intents and purposes, they were the same functionally. And not even like, mine is a straight hammer versus a ball peen, let's say. But I would rather use my hammer that I've used. I have an emotional attachment to it. And I don't have that attachment really to Obsidian or some of the digital tools. I may be a little close with Hypothesis because it really is good at getting out of my way. Whereas Obsidian, I actively have to open it and use it and really go to it. There's work involved in getting there. Whereas with Hypothesis, it happens to be there all the time.
Yeah, I wonder how much of what you're feeling though also has to do with what C. Wright Mills in his art essay at the end of that book that you recommended to me. It calls craftsmanship, right? That there is a and he's sort of he's sort of talking to students, right? And he's advising them to become craftsmen, right? And that there's this sort of ethic involved in it. And I think that, I kind of get the sense that Scott's leaning towards that as well.
And he leans toward it, but in watching his process, I'm not sure how much there's a craft to his note-taking and his style. And he has a very chatty, very wordy style. And I find, and perhaps there are pieces that I know he's rewritten since I read it, although very small. And I'm reasonably certain he didn't go out and hire a professional editor to work on this with him. So there are many places where he tends to repeat himself. And I've only seen one or two places where note takers who have used this style will indicate when they use a card in a chapter or a section, they'll put like a blue pencil tick mark on it to indicate, I've used this before, don't use it again, or don't use it again too soon, or make a note of where you used it so you're not using it 3 times in the same book. And I think because of the kind of roundabout style that Scott has throughout this, and I think I made a note, I found a thing somewhere on like page 350. He says something like, Jesus Christ, Scott, what took you so long to actually get to the meat of the substance? Like, here's the thing we all came for, and it's finally, we're going to talk about it on, 3/4 of the way into the book. So he at least has a sense of humor about it, which is hilarious.
Yeah.
But there is a lot of setup and motivation, which I think is lost to some of us who have read 3 books and 4 handbooks on this topic and know it in and out and left and right, versus a presumed audience Scott may have of people who haven't read anything about any of this, or maybe saw 1 or 2 videos. So let's immerse everyone into a little more of the recent history of the whys and wherefores, which is always good. But at the same time, I think with some better editing and care and watching of which cards went where, this book could have done the same job at half the size and focus. I like the fact that he focuses more later on some of the, write this down on this card, put it here, do this card there, and it literally walks you through it, which I think is a problem a lot of people have in abstracting Zonka Ahrens's written version of here's how you do it versus okay, now I've got my cards, where does the rubber meet the road and what do I do when? Because that's 90% of the content on a lot of the forums is what do I do when this happens, instead of just do it and trust that you'll figure it out sooner or later. If it's important, it'll come back up.
Right. How do I know when I've written a permanent note?
You'll know you've written a permanent note because it'll be something you'll revisit.
Right.
And it's not even how do I know I've written a permanent note, but how do I know I've written a good note that is going to become a central core focus of this thing I'm working on? How do I know I've written a core note that's going to have 500 notes after I've written it? That's when you know you've written a good note is, okay, here's the beginning of a new tree branch or a whole new tree trunk itself that becomes a new section. And to me, that's part of why I presume why Luhmann went from ZK1 to ZK2. I've got 108 topics in the first one, and it's a big crazy mess. And I want to focus more on this smaller handful of topics. So I'm going to start all over and do something slightly different, which is, a major undertaking. And I don't think a lot of people, make it even to subject 10 in the first one, much less get 108 branches in and then say, let's start a new one.
Let's prune. Yeah. It's I think that for me, a big element of this is going to be sort of setting up the workflow, right? Because I read a book, I wrote a Substack, and actually often to go back to what Stephanie or somebody said earlier, or maybe Stephanie, you just nodded approval when someone else said it. I tend to write essays. And that was a problem for me on, in Rome and Obsidian, right? Was my, I didn't have anything, there was nothing atomic about what I was doing. I would write these things that, that would go on for 1,500 words. And so I have, and then I would think, and I don't necessarily want, I'm not saying that I want to, I feel that I must change that, or I want to change that. But I want to go to what Chris said, I want my ideas to be portable. And so I want my, I want something that I wrote about this book that I read, that I wrote a Substack, post about, to be, to abstract out, to be portable in something else, in the thing, because I objected to the guy's interpretation. And so now I want to say, well, okay, what am I going to use in my own? So now the question for me is, I've got this little deck of cards that I wrote when I was, kind of going through that. And in that one, I actually, I got the new Kindle thing that just came out. And you can handwrite little cards, and so that's what I did was I hand wrote little cards, and then I hand wrote them again on actual little cards, which actually it's kind of interesting because Scott a couple of times sort of talks about cognitive science type stuff in the same way that he talks about for example on 40, he talks about maintenance rehearsal, elaborative rehearsal, things like that. And then in a similar way to the way that Zonka Ahrens talked about, all of that stuff around retrieval practice, right? And he really, it was sort of like he had just read a couple of books on retrieval practice and was like, oh, I've got a bunch of notes on that. I'll pull them in. And they were appropriate, right?
I'm curious about your practice, Dan. So I'll mention that in reading and taking notes occasionally, and most of the time I'm doing it in public in hypothesis.
Mhm.
So I'll start a note, and maybe once or twice a week, that what starts out as a short note or observation will get the muse working in my brain, and I'll write 1,000-word essay, and that suddenly that note. And the nice part about hypothesis, that window expands, so I can just drag it down and keep writing all day if I want.
Mhm.
And every now and then it turns into that short thing. Whatever I was reading becomes the writing prompt for, oh, but what about? And then that turns into an essay.
Mhm.
And when I move that somewhere else, there are pieces of it, and occasionally I'll go in the process of, oh, I can link this to 5 other notes immediately. And if I can think of what they are and find them quickly, I'll link them instantaneously so that I don't have to do the work later.
Mhm.
But occasionally that'll turn into a 1,500-word essay with footnotes and the whole 9 yards. And I'll spit it out and copy and paste it. Here it is on the blog and go.
Right.
But occasionally there will be bits and pieces I'll take from other notes I've written that I'll just literally pick up, copy, paste them into that mini thing, because I can do it and I'm motivated to do it now, which is part of that, Luhmann quote about, I only do what comes easy.
Mhm.
Well, if it's here and it's now and I'm motivated, it's easy.
Right.
So I'll do it. Occasionally it's a half-written essay and I may come back to it 3 weeks later and finish it out, or I may be missing a key idea that doesn't let me finish it now.
Mhm.
But I'll have it, and then I can reuse it. And then how many essays do you need like that to build up and take 4 essays and turn that into a chapter, or take half a dozen chapters and then turn that into a book?
Mhm.
And does that suit your needs or your style or your function or your job? In your case, you may want to write a monograph and take a handful of essays that then become a monograph or a book chapter or a whole book. I have a feeling a lot of people who are doing this online don't even have a website where they could put a full blog post, and instead it becomes, their notes become cards in a tweet storm, maybe.
Mhm. Yeah, or video script, or yeah.
But it's, I don't know if that happens to you, that you start writing and then you just go onto the next card and the next card and the next card, and then say, oh, here is this week's essay, and I'm done, because you're motivated in the moment to do that thing, versus, and a lot of time I'm taking notes and it's individual and they all fly around, and then eventually 3 weeks or a month later, and I've seen people, I now know I have 4 or 5 followers of my hypothesis account who regularly read, or at least they dip into things I'm writing in hypothesis.
Mhm.
And then when a month later I write a 7,000-word essay, which I did recently, in insanity, but it took me less than a day to put it together because I had everything. At least 3 people emailed me separately and said, it's really fascinating to have been reading your notes for the past 3 months and then see this as the result. And I can see exactly where in your notes, or things I know I have seen you write in your notes, that are now in this thing, and you have put it together like a big jigsaw puzzle to make it make sense. And I think those pieces are what we're missing more of, okay, there's this system and this process, but how do you now make the notes come together in some bigger cohesive sense? I don't know if folks saw it a week or 2 ago. I found a video for a design historian who essentially, he used 5 by 8 inch index cards, which is exceedingly rare in my reading. Almost nobody uses cards that big. But he did, and he wrote this 2-volume, like, stunning masterpiece on the history of design across cultures.
Wow.
And he made a 3-minute video of, here's how I took notes, here's how I collated things and made bibliographies. He didn't say what size, but it looks like it's about A2. It's just a massive big sheet print, desk size piece of paper, a pad of paper, and he starts mapping out, and he takes his notes and he maps out full chapters on these big sheets. And then he posts those on the wall and uses those in combination with his notes to write the book. And I think he says somewhere in there, it's like, I read this thing and I took the notes. I've seen it once. Then I made the map. I've seen it twice now. And the third time, as I'm going from the map and my notes, I'm processing it a third time, by which point you know the material pretty well and you know kind of how it fits in. You know, and it's rare to see people kind of do that last mile of the process. And I'm kind of hoping that somehow Scott manages to do that at the end of the book.
Yeah,
I know he's released at least a couple thousand cards of his own Antinet that he used to write the book. And I'm kind of curious to see if I can map those cards to pieces of the book and reverse engineer that to see how that process works. But
yeah.
Yeah,
I need to catch up with I've been kind of buried with the end of the semester, but I've been meaning to sort of catch up with what you've been doing.
Oh, I don't recommend anyone like dig into my thing.
No, you are one of the, I actually, it's not as easy as it might be to follow people on hypothesis, but you are one of the people who I actually kind of go out of the way to try to track down what you've been up to. I think that for me, that's going to be the big thing, right? Is remembering to kind of close the loop and taking, okay, so I've got, let's see, well, there are only 15 or so, but then there are side branches of this little deck. And so, I need now to go back, now that I've sort of written this thing, I need to go back and, and keyword these and index them. Because I'm guessing that is the key. That's my expectation. Oh, cool. Thanks for the link. For folks who are new here, an incentive to actually joining the Obsidian Vault is that we post the chat transcripts. And usually they have a lot of links on them. And also we have a little community forum page where we, kind of put our news and things. And then, and then some of us in the past have sort of demoed our processes. And, Pat has written a lot just recently about, sort of his digital version of Scott's Antinet Zettelkasten. So, which I've read part of, but not all of yet, Pat. So yeah, we kind of have, and I mentioned this now because we're 15 minutes or so from the end of our time. We usually go 90 minutes. The conversation oftentimes sort of continues in a leisurely way on the vault, and then and people kind of elaborate on things that they may have begun to say or whatever in the actual meeting. So yeah, as I was reading this, as I was getting towards the third and fourth chapters, I started writing notes like index is the key. So I did not buy the bonus material. Did anybody buy the bonus material? It was kind of ironically, it seemed like the bonus material is going to be the newsletter that he put aside to write the book.
Yep, I was also very interested in reading the archives of his own notes to see more about that, because I want to see. I'm curious about the conventions that he's developed and hasn't talked about. There are some things as well that he hasn't talked about much in his videos that he completely skipped in his masterclass, and I'm curious to see if they're going to be in the book that he does for his Antinet. So I'm also curious on the archive to see if those things show up, because he hasn't talked about them much, but he's quickly mentioned them in like some video somewhere in his YouTube channel. So I was mostly curious about the archive to read through it.
Yeah, I would like to see the archive too. I just wasn't willing to make that investment once the trial ends. So yeah, I think one of the things, Chris, to kind of go back to your point about how long he took to sort of get to and sort of make some of these points. I'm sort of hoping it's the Anton Chekhov, gun on the mantelpiece kind of thing. That this is Act 1, and he's going to shoot that gun in Act 3, and which I haven't. I've sort of scrolled through the whole thing, and I've noticed, I've looked at the headings and stuff, but I haven't read through the whole thing yet. So I'm hoping that some of these things, some of the neuroscience, psychology elements will be paid off, and some of these other things that he's just. I mean, he says the name Richard Feynman once and then moves on. So again, there's probably a lot that could be unpacked.
I am kind of curious if anyone has heard of it, but there's a lot of people will talk about the Feynman method of, that essentially is encapsulated, like, to be able to say or understand something, you should be able to re-encapsulate it and formulate it so that a fifth grader could understand it. Mm-hmm. So if you really know quantum mechanics well, you should be able to, in a few short paragraphs or a few sentences, explain what quantum mechanics is at the level of a fifth grader, and that's how you understand it.
That's why I love those 5 levels videos.
Yeah, and so in my notes, I will use the phrase Feynman technique as the tag for occurrences of this thing in other areas, or I'll use Aaron's has a framing that he talks about writing for understanding. So you may reformulate what you read in a paragraph into a sentence as a demonstration kind of to yourself that you understand and get that topic. But this has got to be a thing that goes back much further, but I don't see this idea much or at all prior to the 20th century. And I don't see alternate names for it as a thing of writing for understanding, or this, the Feynman technique as a thing. And so I'm curious if anyone else has come across it or other alternate names for it. Or if you do, let me know.
God, I think I just recently ran into it in a book by Lee Smolin, where he talks about, sort of Feynman believing that, he or testing himself that he understood a topic when he could teach it. So yeah, but I mean, and it would seem like that would be something that there would be a long kind of lineage of.
Yeah, and particularly I've been looking for it in educational circles or early educational treatises on pedagogy or thinking and philosophy, and I don't see it at all. So I'm curious if it originated with Feynman and it's something he noticed in his own work and then it assumed the name. In fact, I don't even know where the original first version of Feynman technique is used as a thing to describe it.
Yeah.
And that's, hiding in the history somewhere. I'll find it eventually, but
yeah. Well, if you do, let us know. And if I do, I'll poke around a little bit too, because I think that is I think that's kind of an interesting thing. Now Pat said something in the chat about indexes and keywords. Yeah, and I think that is sort of central to this argument, this dialogue, at least, if not argument, about about the value of numbering and indexing and keywording. I suspect that it's probably personal, but for me, I think that is going to be more powerful than the search capabilities. That as a memory and a kind of of a building technique, that process, that actual physical process, is going to be more valuable than the ability to search. So Nick, and then John.
Yeah, so my thoughts on the search for digital and then index for analog is, again, they serve different purposes. So, for example, I actually wrote about this. The slow search using the index I see as a good thing. Whereas on Obsidian, when you search something, you find exactly what you want instantly, practically. I think in the concept of the search, when you type something in, you'll see the note that you're thinking of, or a note related, very closely related to it. Whereas on the index, when you're thinking of a certain note or a certain concept that you're thinking of, you've just written a note and you're trying to think, where should I file this? I normally think and see, or other notes that I've written in the past come back, or topics or keywords that I've written come back. Then I search through my index. While searching through my index, I go through a bunch of different keywords and basically get very, very small snapshots, like just a very quick reminder that I've written about this before. After I found the topic in my index, then I go to the general section. Then I'll flip through notes and I'll get this very quick reminder of all the notes I've written in that general area. And because notes that are similar are filed together, I'm basically getting a bunch of cues for things that I've written about. And as I've mentioned before, whereas in Obsidian, when I write something, it's more detailed and I'll read it and I'll have that understanding. On analog, even just with the title, I can get cued for an entire train of thought to come back. So then I'll eventually find the note. So in analog, the index basically guides you through, and it's a very wavy path through the forest. Like, it's not a direct path, whereas Obsidian will just cut through the trees to the specific part that you're looking for. I find it'll show you exactly what you're looking for in Obsidian, the search feature, and then in analog, it'll go around and eventually show you what you're looking for. But on the way there, you'll see a bunch of other things as well.
Yeah.
But there might be a plugin that does that for Obsidian, or another note-taking app. I'm not sure. I've not used that many.
There was a random walk kind of a plugin, but it wasn't really that cool.
I know the Brain tool does that. There's like a walk through notes button, and then it will just go through random notes in the Brain. So that's another thing similar.
Mm-hmm. John.
I was just going to say, I had a professor in grad school who had this theory. It's called generative theory of learning. And he did a number of studies with elementary students. He would have them read a paragraph. And of course, he had different groups for his experiment. But in one group, the kids would read a paragraph and then simply write a title for the paragraph. And the act of writing the title increased their ability to comprehend and remember. So I think you're right. I think it is the index system that helps with the elaboration of memory, as well as rehearsal. But you could do that in Obsidian if you do it intentionally and deliberately. But maybe Obsidian is too efficient in that way, that you don't, because you watch Scott, he's writing the word, he's filing it. So all of this is around the central note that he's working on. And all of that causes more elaboration in memory. And then the good point that Nick just made about going in reverse from index to note, it's sort of a rambling path through that forest, guided by a few of your indices. Mm-hmm. Still not convinced you can't do that in Obsidian if you do it deliberately and don't rely on the searches.
Oh, I think you're absolutely. Well, I think you're absolutely. I should have said I absolutely agree with you, John. I think though that was my problem, was although I could do it in Obsidian, I wasn't doing it, and and so I think that something like analog, or maybe something like Scrintl and analog, might clear the decks and allow me to focus more on that. Go ahead, Nick.
Yeah, about like digital tools as well. I know someone mentioned the Brain at some point. The Brain was something that I got into before I even learned about Zettelkasten, and I had experimented with it. If I remember correctly, the Brain does not have a search feature. So if you're trying to find a note you've written wrong, okay, I am wrong. I've just never found it then. But I remember if I had a note I was trying to find, I had to go through all of the past notes I had written.
I think, yeah, I've only used it a little bit. I think it does have a search. Obviously, all of those searches though require you to know what you're searching for, right? And that's, so it's sort of the there's a crazy line from an old movie called The Zero Effect, which for a long time I thought it was from Douglas Adams, but it wasn't. About when you go out in the world looking for something, it's very difficult because you're looking for one thing, and the world's got a lot of things in it. Whereas on the other hand, if you just go out into the world looking for anything, you're likely to find it because there's a lot of things in the world. So I think that putting the effort into thinking about what these things are before I put them in the drawer might be key. Tim, go ahead.
Yeah, I think rather like last week, and I said about the fact that I managed to get a single hit on a Google search. If you're one of those people that try and use tags to assist you in your browsing rather than your explicit search, such that you're not too focused on either a word or a phrase, such that you don't miss all of the alternatives if the word is used slightly different. If I'm looking for, it's one of the things that's nice with Obsidian to a certain extent versus Evernote, I can put it in Slipnote, aliases, Zettelkasten. In Obsidian, I can't do that in Evernote. So if I'm looking too close and too precise, or as I often am working in 6 or 7 languages at the same time, and I'm saying, let's go forward and finish the project planning and all the rest of it. And that's all European forward-looking focus. And all the Chinese go, what's up there? Because Chinese language is focused on time and progress is the vertical axis, not the horizontal forward backward. So you get the problem of the idioms of different language, of different ideas, and not everybody is going to express it exactly the same every time, everywhere. So, I see things. I'm no biologist, but I'm still getting instances where I get evolutionary biology from either Richard Dawkins or even Stephen Jay Gould popping up, and or E.O. Wilson for bits of biology in engineering terms, because it's a system thing more than an engineering nuts and bolts. I mean, it's all, even if you just have it in engineering, between, say, the UK and the US, the mechanical guys and the electrical guys, and if we exclude all the other types for a moment, don't all use the same word for the same thing. The nuts and bolts actually don't even go the same way round in all cases. If anybody ever had a Puncher or a Land Rover or a Rolls Royce, they use the Russian style nuts and bolts, such that going forward tightens the wheel up. Everybody else uses one nut and bolt on all 4 tyres, so 2 of them are tightening and 2 of them are getting loose. So we are not all thinking the same, etc. And that's why I quite like using relatively loose keywords. It puts you in the right, in the UK, I would say parish, because the parish is smaller than a community, and there are often several parishes to a village, a couple of 100 parishes to a town, thousands to a city, in effect. I'm in the right parish, and even though I may not see the wood for the trees, I can see the next dozen trees. I'm not too far off. The parish might be 100, but I can see 25 in all directions or something. I'm getting closer. I may not be exact, but I'm getting closer.
Mhm.
You know, and it's then a case of, do I pick a tree and climb it to see what else I can see, or do I go from one to the next to the next to the next, and then make sure that I leave breadcrumbs to go back to where I was when I thought I was close, if I end up by being cold. You know?
Mhm.
There's
Well, and that's
an
what,
element
to go
of-
back to what Nick was saying, that's one of the things, you know, once you're in the parish, then there's some value in looking at those other things that are sort of around what you were.
Yeah.
And I think Matthew was kind of mentioning
and
that.
it's also why I quite like. There's one thing I think on that, and we go back to all the history we've had with Nicholas Luhmann. The one thing that's being said about him is he never went back to an original source. I don't believe that, because I know that I'll go back multiple times to pick up something that I thought may have been irrelevant to project A, because I've got the link and I've got breadcrumbs for it and I know where it came from. I can go back. That's a much more of a regulation type thing for me, at least.
That's an Aaronsism, and actually, I challenged him when he visited the Rome Book Club, and he kind of backed away from that claim that went back to a source.
Yeah, I could well imagine it. It's a nice thing, but I don't think anybody manages to go through and picks up everything possible that could be interesting. I mean, if what would happen if the first book you picked up and you were going to do this sort of process turned out to be something as wide-ranging as Bill Bryson's A Short History of Everything? You'd never get to the end. It just covers everything badly, and now you'll be constantly saying Bill's wrong, not because he's not because he's actually wrong. He's just 20 years out of date. And then you've got that next 20 years and you foolishly stick it into Research Rabbit or something, and there's another 10 careers worth of time and lots to follow. You know? Come back, Hans Rosling, please organise all my bubbles.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, no, I mean, elements of this, until you're getting to a real, true, relatively tight purpose in some form of output, I'm always finding that the best keywords are relatively loose, but don't, in terms of, say, like environmental management or even environmental law, don't use a keyword that says climate change. Because in theory, if you're in environmental law or environmental management, for instance, currently, that's such a useful buzzword. It's going to be on every note. Yeah. Anyway.
Yeah.
Time.
Yep. Yeah, and that, I think the goal directedness is really important. And Scott does mention that also right at the beginning in the preface, right? He says, and he defines the end goal as developing knowledge. I wrote a card about it, you know, which I interpret as meaning producing output. So I think. Oh, see you later, Mark. Mark's going. So people are starting to drop off. We've kind of gone over our time. So Nick, you want to go, and then Tim.
Yes, there was, as you mentioned, the goal related nature of the Antinet. I think is something else that's often looked over, because now that I've been using this for 2 years, when I'm reading something, I have a very specific goal that I'm reading for. Right now, it's neuroevolution. The goal that I'm working towards is trying to create human level intelligence through an evolution process. So now when I'm reading practically anything, that's what I'm reading for. And surprisingly, in books, maybe not surprisingly, but for example, the notes that I've taken from Scott's book are related to neuroevolution and creating human level artificial intelligence. So having that goal in mind as you're reading something makes you see it through that lens.
Mhm.
And you can pick up things that you would just skip over if you didn't have a specific goal. And this is something I'm still trying to wrap my head around, because there's a distinction in different types of reading. When I'm learning something completely new, I'm not reading it at all the same way as when I'm reading something for a specific goal. But I have yet to wrap my head around how to make that distinction.
Mhm. Well, and I think that we, yeah, and I've sort of wrestled with that a little bit. Yeah, I will. There should have been to go back to the chat. There was a link, and Dropbox should have sent you a link. If it didn't, Stephanie, then let me know, and I'll send you another one. To go to what you were saying, Nick. Yeah, I don't think that I think there's a myth that we read as a blank slate. And I don't think we ever do that. I think it's impossible to actually do that. I think that there are times when we do slightly more of that, maybe if we're reading literature, we want to be more open to it going in different directions. But often, most of the time, we're looking for something. And I think that is completely okay. I think that's why Aaron's kind of mistakenly said that Luhmann didn't go back, right? Because a lot of the times Luhmann's reading something some very specific article for a very specific point, and he doesn't, probably ever feel that he needs to go back. But yeah, to really squeeze all of the blood out of the stone would take a lot of work. Tim, did you want to throw in a last word here? No, Chris, you're.
No, the hand was up as a residual. Sorry.
Oh, okay. All right. Chris, you're muted, but were you going to say something?
Maybe I was. I don't know.
Okay. Well, we're over time.
I have found one thing in Johann Schmidt's article. When he posts a picture, or at least one picture of Luhmann's bibliography note, you actually see that Luhmann goes back. Because you see him writing something about page 143, 150, and then a little lines under that, he goes back to something on page 30 or something. So you see he does go back.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And oftentimes they're in different colors of pen and all that kind of stuff. So obviously he's returning to cards, and I think that's another element of the practice that I am, that part of my goal for this section of the club is to sort of continue to refine my own practice of how I go back, when I review, when I go over. And actually, I was standing over at my box. So I have this down the end of my office. I have this card catalog thing is what I'm talking about. And I was standing down there and I was looking at the index, and I was thinking, I really need to, I need to spend a good 6 hours and, kind of revise this index and go through it again. So yeah, but so the plan for next week is that we will look at just the 2 chapters, 5 and 6, which are sort of meatier, I think, than this introductory section, and will probably give us some kind of specific details of the beginnings of processes to sort of process ourselves and think about and argue with and whatnot. And we can begin doing that in the vault, and then kind of continue in person. And so yeah, Stephanie, I will get you a link again. Maybe Dropbox may have. Did you change the email that you were wanting?
Yeah, I sent a request. So my Dropbox is for my business. So it's not so I sent a request from the email. But if you email me, we can figure it out.
Okay, and and since you have your own Dropbox, there may be a little bit of additional complexity there.
Yeah.
But, yeah, we'll work that out. Okay. And I will post. So I'll post this chat transcript in the folder which is called 06 Antinet Book Club. And then I will, Zoom will take its time processing this recording, but then I will put it up on YouTube sometime late this afternoon or early tomorrow morning. And yeah, and thank you very much. I think this was a good start. I think we've got a lot to cover. It will get much more, I think, technical from here on in, and kind of about the details of the process. So I'm looking forward to that.
Oh, before you go, Dan, remind us too. I know you have a little coffee tip jar thing, so we can help you support your Zoom costs.
I do have I've got a thing called Buy Me. I don't even remember. I haven't looked at it in a while. Buy Me a Coffee, and I don't know if can I find a link to it is the question. Hang on.
I know you got big finance charges to pay off that massive card catalog in the back room there. So
yeah, that was which I got off of Facebook. My wife luckily does have Facebook, and she looks at Facebook Marketplace from time to time, and so yeah, so this is where it is. It is not mandatory at all. I do I do put. I actually just let Obsidian Publish go because I'm planning on publishing on Scribble for free. So my expenses are being reduced a little bit. But yeah, that's I don't know if I would even call it a side hustle, but whatever. It is what it is. Thanks, Chris.
I'd be very loath to put a budget together for the cost of the annual cost of my note-taking habit. I didn't do well this year.
Yeah, that's true. I actually am kind of afraid to.
And I try not to even subscribe to the stuff.
Yeah. Luckily, I've been able to buy a lot of used books from Abe Books this semester because I've been working with early American primary sources. But usually that's a big expense as well. Oh, okay. I will. I just got a side email from John. So yeah, I'll get that out to you as well. All right, cool. Well, thank you very much. This was fun.
Okay.
And see you next week.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Dan.
It was great.
Take care.
Thank you very much.